Coming in at 5, the Southend Werewolf. This is perhaps the most unusual case on our list. This investigation took the Warrens out of the US into a seaside town in Essex, England, where a man named Bill Ramsey lived, who was believed to be possessed by a demon that manifested as a wolf. Backstory: growing up, Ramsey was a normal kid. However, one day at the age of 9, he suddenly began to exhibit inhuman qualities. One report stated that while playing outside in his backyard, Ramsey felt a frigid cold overtake him. He was overcome with an awful stench before flying into a rage and uprooting a fence post, gnawing on its wire meshing. He remained incident-free up until the 1960s, during which time he was plagued with nightmares, cold sweats, and began to wake up panting like a wild animal. In the 1980s, Bill would become overwhelmed by the sensations he experienced when he was young, and at one point he attacked a friend in a car on their way home from a pub, and manhandled the police in an intense altercation. The Warrens were of course called in, during which time they stated that Ramsey would ask to be locked up in a jail cell for his protection and the protection of the public. They ended up asking Ramsey to come to their Connecticut home, where Bishop Robert McKenna would perform a recorded exorcism on Ramsey. In at 4, Arne Cheyenne Johnson. The trial of Arne Cheyenne Johnson is baffling and the first known case in the US that used the "devil made me do it" as its defense. On the night of February 16, 1981, Johnson, who was just 19 years old at the time, was out for dinner with his fiancée and their landlord Alan Bono. Johnson stabbed Bono multiple times using his pocket knife and later went on to plead not guilty by possession, a defense that was founded on Johnson's relationship with his fiance's brother, David. In 1980, David woke up to what he described as a man with big black eyes, a thin face with animal features and jagged teeth, pointed ears, horns, and hoofs. The demon-like creature scared David so much that he turned to his sister Ann Johnson for help. They turned to a priest, which only angered the entity more, causing it to make David hiss and quote Paradise Lost. The Warrens were brought in, and during one particular interview they stated, I quote, "While Ed interviewed the boy, I saw a black misty form next to him, which told me we were dealing with something of a negative nature. Soon the child was complaining that invisible hands were choking him, and there were red marks on him. He said that he had a feeling of being hit." The Warrens worked alongside 4 priests to exorcise more than 40 demons from David. However, Johnson seemed to be the new target, and after he stabbed his landlord, he was found guilty of first-degree manslaughter, after his claims of possession didn't hold up in court. Coming in at 3, Annabelle the Doll. This case follows the now infamous Annabelle doll, a Raggedy Ann doll that was purchased in an antique store. It was gifted to the buyer's daughter, a nursing student. However, the student and her roommate very quickly began to notice odd occurrences involving the doll, including her changing positions and even leaving notes. Horrible. The messages eventually escalated and blood even appeared on the doll's dress. Annabelle seemed to take aim at the fiancé of one of the roommates, who claims he woke up one night frozen in bed as the doll crawled up his body and tried to strangle him. He also claimed that upon entering a dark room where the doll was sat, he felt something attack him. When he turned on the lights, he saw his stomach covered in bloody scratches, with the doll now on the floor. The Warrens were eventually called in, and they explained that the doll was possessed by the spirit of a deceased 7-year-old girl named Annabelle Higgins, which supposedly died on the land where the apartment stood. However, it was later determined by the Warrens that a demonic presence was in fact behind the doll. They ended up performing a blessing in the home before taking Annabelle and housing her in the Warrens Occult Museum. Coming in at 2, the Amityville Case. This is perhaps the Warrens' most famous paranormal case, with the investigation being adapted into many frightening and unending films. The case involved the Lutz family, who took up residence in a suburban home in Amityville, Long Island in 1975, just 1 year after a deadly mass murder occurred on the property, which saw Ronald DeFeo Jr. brutally kill 6 members of his family. For 28 days the Lutzes were antagonized by spirits. They heard voices, saw swarms of flies, and were inflicted with welts. The Warrens were eventually called in to cleanse the home, bringing with them a local TV crew. While there, they snapped a handful of pictures, including one that seemed to show a boy with glowing eyes. The Warrens ultimately determined that the land was cursed, and Lorraine considered it to be the one case that continuously haunted her, stating, "Amityville was horrible. It was absolutely horrible. It followed us right straight across the country. I will never go in the Amityville house ever again." End quote. And lastly, coming in at number 1, the Perron family haunting. This now infamous case follows the Perrons, a family that moved to an idyllic 200-acre home in Harrisville, Rhode Island, a home that hid some very dark and disturbing secrets. The home was originally built in 1736 and was inhabited by Bathsheba Thayer and her 4 children, 3 of whom died young. The deaths and circumstances around the deaths drew in a lot of suspicion within the town, resulting in them ostracizing Bathsheba, who was ultimately labeled a Satanist by her community. She then went on to hang herself in her own backyard. Now, during the Perrons' stay at the home, they experienced a lot of ghostly interactions, including spirits playing with her children. Bathsheba also appeared to them, only she was far more menacing than the children that haunted the residence. They heard heard disembodied voices and watched on as furniture moved on its own. The Perron family also stated that Bathsheba targeted the mother, Carolyn, and was jealous of her motherhood. The Warrens were ultimately brought in to help the family in 1974, however the presence only worsened the situation, so much so that the family asked the Warrens to leave.
Coming in at number 5, we have Locked in the Closet. This creepy tale comes to us from Sassy Girl over on Your Ghost Stories. They tell the story of the time during summer break when her mum had gone to work and her aunt had come over to babysit herself and her sister. She was around 8 years old at the time and her cousin a year younger. Her sister was almost 4 years older than herself. It was a hot day, so they decided to play inside, with the group settling on hide and seek. Her sister wanted to start, so the rest of them began to hide. They wanted to hide on the shelf in one of the closets, knowing the sister would never find them there. However, they couldn't get up, so they settled themselves at the back of the closet behind clothes and shoes. They waited, and as they did, they heard something to the right of them. It was a little sound like something shifted, or someone shifted. They ignored it and continued playing. Then the door to the upstairs opened. The sound once again was heard, but they ignored it. Then someone entered the room, and they struggled not to laugh. They stood there for a moment, the shadows of their feet could be seen under the door. Then they heard the door lock. They both jumped up and yelled for it to be opened, but the knob wouldn't turn. It wouldn't even budge. However, the sister kept persisting that the door wasn't locked. She had never locked it. She assumed they were holding onto the knob. Finally, they all realized the door was stuck. They locked and unlocked the door, but nothing. However, finally the door swung open on its own accord. They never hid in the closet again. Later that night, they had their dad check all the doors. He tried every single way he could, yet he couldn't find anything wrong with the door. So what exactly was inside the closet with them? The boogeyman? Perhaps. Coming in at number 4, we have Strange Noises. This story comes to us from Experience PSA, who tells of the time around a week ago, at the time of posting, when they awoke at around 1 AM by a strange tapping noise. It was a fast-paced tap with a tiny metallic ring to it. They sat up, attempting to locate the source of the noise. However, it continued as they held their breath to get a better sense of where it was coming from. After a minute, they realized the tapping was coming from inside the room, more precisely their desk. They had on their desk one of those Newton's cradle things. As a time passer, you know, the ones with the balls. You pick up one ball, swing it, hits the others, and it bounces back and forth until it never ends, until the world ends. This was the source of the noise. They sat in awe for a few moments, with the cradle not losing energy. In the end, they stopped the ball themselves and went back to sleep. However, 2 nights later at 2:27 AM, the tapping once again began. This time, they stood up and stopped the cradle, mockingly stating, "Very funny, spirit," and then went back to bed. An hour later, though, a dull hum could be heard. It continued for half an hour until a slight crash sounded on the desk. They got up to investigate and discovered the cradle had been knocked over, and their notebook was now open with a bend in one of the pages. Creepy indeed. What do you guys think? Angry boogeyman who is not a fan of Newton's cradle? To be fair, I love those things. I could watch them go back and forth all day. In at number 3, we have Grandma Drowned the Boogeyman. Another story coming to us from Your Ghost Stories. This one was posted by Valkyrie Cry, who tells the story of the time her grandmother supposedly drowned the boogeyman. She begins by stating that it was 1946 in rural Kentucky. The twins, her older sisters, were 5 years old at the time and living with their mother in a small cabin on their grandmother's property. They were quiet, well-behaved children. That was until the arrival of the boogeyman. It came out of nowhere, the children yelling in the night, screaming that the boogeyman was there. Now, of course, the mother always assured them that the boogeyman wasn't real, and even if he were, they had nothing to worry about. They were well-behaved children. However, little did the children know the mother was also afraid. On several occasions, doors that were left closed were now open, and the children's rooms would often smell of rotten eggs. There were even occasions where she discovered weird drag marks in the dirt outside the window, as if someone with a limp had come that way. Privately, she told her father that she feared that the boogeyman might be some homeless person lurking about the house. Days dragged by, the boogeyman taking its toll on the family, mostly due to lack of sleep. So one day the grandmother decided to consult with Aunt Sylvie about the situation, resulting in the grandmother consulting with a known witch. The grandmother came home, ushering everyone into their rooms, remarking that she will deal with the boogeyman. From the next room she could be heard yelling, "See this broom, you devil, I'm going to beat you with it. Now you get out of here in the name of Jesus and never come back." After a short while, the grandmother returned, stating that they needn't worry anymore because she chased him down to the river where he drowned. To be honest, let's hope it's the boogeyman, otherwise grandmother killed an innocent man. Coming in at number 2, the closet. This story comes to us from orphans on Your Ghost Stories. They write of a time a few years back when they were babysitting for their aunt and had just put their cousin to sleep. They state that they turned around and began walking down the hall into the living room when they suddenly heard their cousin screaming. She found her crying, saying that she saw the boogeyman. She put her back to sleep and left once again. However, 20 minutes later, the screaming resumed. She went into the bedroom and saw her crying once again. However, this time she heard a crash coming from inside the walk-in closet. The handle began turning back and forth on its own, and the door slowly creaked open. She quickly picked up her cousin and ran. She never told her aunt what happened. Would anyone really believe her? What do you think? The boogeyman? The wind? Anything else? Creaky door? And finally, coming in at number 1, we have the boogeyman. Now, this story comes to us from It's Pixie on Your Ghost Stories, who tells of the time she was staying with her parents in a quiet suburb in South Africa. Now, the story itself occurs when she was just 13 years old, and she says it still haunts her to this day. She states that she remembers waking up in the early hours one morning, feeling panicked and afraid, feeling like someone was watching her, as though she wasn't alone. She didn't move but scanned the room. She didn't see anything. A few days passed with no occurrences. However, one night she woke up again with the same fear and panic. She scanned the room, and this time she saw something. It was sitting on her desk in front of her bed. It was small, almost like a garden gnome. It had yellow eyes, sharp little teeth, and pointed fingers. She recalled it just staring at her. She had never felt so scared in her life. She screamed and her dad came running in the room. Of course, he didn't believe what she saw. Following that, she was scared to go to bed alone. She could always feel it watching her. And not only that, but it also began scratching the underside of her bed at night, once again waking her up. This time she saw the creature on her desk, however it was now smiling, the most evil smile she had ever seen. According to the user, this went on for years. Nothing she did ever made it go away. One night, like all the previous nights, she awoke to find him sitting on her desk again. She closed her eyes and covered her face, but she knew he was still there. Then she felt him jump onto the bed. She didn't dare move. She could feel him scratching her arm. Then she screamed. The following morning, she found 4 scratches on her arm. Time passed and things got better. However, when the user turned 18, something else happened. She was staying at a friend's house when suddenly everyone awoke in the middle of the night to her friend's boyfriend screaming. She knew the creature was there. The boy began yelling, "The boogeyman is here. The boogeyman is here." He saw the exact same creature as her. She ends the story with, "I'm 26 now and I haven't seen or felt it again after that night."
Coming in number 5, need more children. If anyone ever says this phrase to you, feel free to run away at speeds previously unknown to man, or knock them out. You have my full support. However, if the individual in question ends up being a Wendigo, then you're probably not gonna have much luck with either of those tasks. They're just too strong and too spooky. And they get what they want most of the time, as evidenced by the story told by a now deleted Reddit user. I wonder how they're doing these days. I'll do my best to abridge this story for the sake of the length of today's video, so here we go. A man, his girlfriend, and their 3-year-old son all went out of town on a camping trip. At the behest of his superstitious partner, our storyteller packed the classic camping supplies, plus a shotgun, rifle, combat knife, and machete. When they reached their campsite, they noticed that the park rangers were kind of on edge and didn't seem to notice that they brought a whole pile of weapons. Odd. Onwards they trudged though and set up camp. That night they witnessed a horrible scene. It looked like someone had brutally killed a large animal, a buck perhaps, and dragged it away by the antlers. Not an easy task by any metric. Unnerved but resolute, they ate dinner and fed their son, then went to bed. In the middle of the night, a strange noise echoed throughout the woods, waking the man. He sat up and heard what sounded like muffled crying, prompting him to peek outside of the tent. What he saw he couldn't quite explain. It was like an enormous deer, slightly misshapen with enormous antlers and a strangely human presence about it. The man didn't need to see anything else. He pulled out his gun and shot it multiple times, causing it to bleed and shriek. It didn't die though, and before it disappeared into the night, it said the words, "Need more children." The man and his panicked wife then passed out. The panic didn't disappear the next morning either, as their son was not in the tent with them. They called the police, who arrived to investigate the blood left by the creature, and the man seemed to overhear them say something about it getting more bold. Unfortunately, their son was never found. Coming in at number 4, the Texas Wendigo. Traditionally, Wendigo are only found along the East Coast forests, around the Great Plains of the United States, and in the areas surrounding the Great Lakes. It's not often that you'll hear stories of them coming from other places, but parts of Texas are indeed located upon the Great Plains. And this Wendigo in particular made quite the name for itself in the area. From 2016 onwards, folks from the Yorktown, Texas area reported seeing a hulking figure almost 10 feet tall lurking around forested areas. It became such a common sight that a lot of people decided to avoid the woods altogether for a while. One intrepid explorer wanted to get a closer look at the thing, so he started frequenting the spots that it was most often sighted. During his search, he heard many noises characteristic of a Wendigo, the sounds of wounded or dying animals, human-like shrieks, and even basic sentences, all meant to entice him into the woods. Whoever this guy was knew the Wendigo's tricks though, and stayed well away from anywhere he'd be vulnerable. One evening, with plenty of mist still hanging in the air, he ran into the real deal. In an opening, he saw an old metal structure and 2 white houses, and between them a tall, lanky figure. It seemed to be spying on the inhabitants of these homes with devious intentions. He tried to ignore it as best he could as it walked along the path. Suddenly, a wave of overwhelming dread hit him and he got to running. Looking back behind him, he noticed that the Wendigo was now on all 4s, but still stood at around 5 feet tall. Thankfully, it didn't give chase, as the man theorizes that this was because the Wendigo was more interested in the housebound prey. To this day, he still thinks about its bone-white skin, bald head, dark black eyes, and humanoid face. He hasn't revisited the area. Coming in at number 3, we've got the frogs. Sometimes a story will draw you down one path and then pull out a twist so devious your spine will stay tingled for weeks. This is just such a tale. What do frogs have to do with the Wendigo? Well, just sit back and listen and I'll tell you a tale. This comes from Reddit user Unathana, who has a long history of listening to frogs make noise at night. When they were a kid, their grandmother would reassure them that the croaking was actually good as it kept the Wendigo away. Over time, they got used to the sounds and actually found them quite soothing. Flash forward many years, and Unathana is enrolled in post-secondary education, taking a course on Native American literature. The Wendigo that they're learning about here is described a little differently than they remember their grandmother talking about. Frogs don't really do all that much to protect against such a creature. A damn shame. They then moved to a new place on the edge of town within a stone's throw of a pond just packed with frogs. The noise was once again comforting to them, and they tended to keep their windows open to hear them and enjoy the balmy summer heat. However, the night they recounted this story, things were different. Gone was the heat as well as the sound of frogs. In fact, it was unseasonably cold and the night was quieter than ever. This did not bode well for Unathana, not one bit. Every passing second meant more dread, with nowhere to run or hide. The Wendigo is out there somewhere. Better watch out. Coming in at number 2, we've got Anansi's Goat Man. One of the best known Wendigo green text tales, the proliferation of spooky encounter stories on 4chan's paranormal board had a large impact on creepypasta culture in the early 2010s, usually told from a first-person perspective in bullet point form. Well, Anansi's tale starts as a green text, maybe to entice more readers to stick around, but soon becomes a more traditionally written story. It chronicles his trip out to Alabama to visit family and the very strange things that happened while in the rural landscape. He and some cousins went out to a little cabin/trailer in the woods and brought some neighbors and other local kids with them. At first, it was just a smell, something like copper or blood that washed over the area. Nobody could explain it, so they tried to ignore it. Then strange figures appeared in the trees, making awful noises. Folks were freaked out, so they ditched the fire and went inside, which resulted in plenty of loud bangs at the door. Understandably, lots of people were scared and wanted to leave, but trekking back through the woods late at night with no weapons, with all this going on, seemed like a bad idea. They decided to stick it out till morning and then leave once whatever rednecks in the woods stopped messing with them. Soon they realized that there were 12 people in the cabin at some point, and now they were just down to 11. Uh-oh. So the next morning, some people left, but Anansi and his buddy Tanner stuck around with a few more folks. The copper smell came and left over and over again, and soon enough they realized that one of the people they were with was acting weird. She ran off slack-jawed into the woods and nobody saw her again. Tanner's cousin showed up later with a gun and claimed to have seen that girl gibbering alone in the woods. He tried to talk to her, but she didn't respond. Weird. On the last night everyone was at the cabin, somebody fired at the figure in the woods, causing it to scream and thrash for hours. During this time, everyone tried to get some sleep in the cabin while Tanner stood guard with the gun. Half asleep, he noticed someone come in from the bathroom and fall asleep on the floor. But that put their head count at higher than he remembered. It's a bad sign. Just to be safe, he continued to pretend to sleep in the guard chair and noticed that the new addition would convulse and thrash around from time to time. The next morning, everyone left except Tanner, who said he'd lock everything up. Checking the bathroom that the extra body came in from, he noticed that the bathroom window was wide open. Whatever this creature was, it was infiltrating their cabin and pretending to be another person the whole time. Horrifying. And finally at number 1 we've got the gun nut green text. We'll cap off this list with one more green text similar to Anansi's story but with a different twist. A group of friends from college decided to take a trip out to an uncle's cabin. The stench of blood and copper was just as prevalent here, and over time the strange events stacked up. The friends heard their own voices off in the woods, calling out for people to come find them. Dead animals were left all over the property, culminating in 2 halves of a deer being thrown at the side of the cabin. Thankfully, these pals were all a bunch of gun nuts with experience making homemade thermite, and when the going got bad, they got to work. Preparing to leave the cabin in the middle of the night, they had different roles for dealing with their Wendigo assailant. Some took point with rifles, while others packed their things. But at the last moment, after one pal went running off into the woods to see what he could find, they noticed something odd. A figure looking like their friend who had just run off was in the back of the cabin, appearing extra disheveled, pretending to pack up with the rest of them. This was their sign to open fire, and toss one of their homebrew thermite grenades after it. Even then, they can't be sure that they actually put an end to whatever shape-shifting creature was stalking them. The cabin ended up as ash though, so they're not planning on visiting anytime soon.
Kicking off at number 5, the man in the yellow raincoat. And this story is so damn creepy that you'll think twice the next time you see someone sheltering from the rain in a yellow nylon jacket. You never know what they're hiding beneath that bright, shiny exterior. This story from Reddit user Whale Baboon happened roughly around 2004 in Seoul, South Korea. As it goes, their mum's friend lived in a huge apartment complex and her husband worked away during the day. She'd usually run errands with her daughter to keep busy, and on the way back on one particular occasion, she stepped into the building's elevator and noticed a man in a yellow raincoat standing inside, with his head hung low and his face obscured. She instantly felt uneasy and made her daughter stand to the side. What made it even more uncomfortable was the fact that when she went to press the button for her floor, she noticed that no other number was lit. On top of that, the man was clutching something wrapped inside a newspaper to his side. Things started to click and she started to panic. She pulled out her cell phone and pretended to call her husband, saying that she was nearly home and it'd be nice if he could meet them at the door. Obviously, he was still at work, but quick thinking, right? When the elevator reached her floor, she quickly got off and grabbed her daughter. Of course, the man got out too, and of course, he was following her down the hallway. She started banging on the door, calling for her husband, when the man seemed to lose interest and turn around. But when he heard her fumbling for the keycard to her room, he turned back around and sprinted at them. Thankfully, the woman and her daughter got inside with seconds to spare. But it's the epilogue to this story where the real terror lies. Several months later, she was watching the news when coverage on the capture of a serial killer named Yu Young-chul came on the screen. It was awful, she thought, but when the news program showed images of the familiar yellow raincoat that the killer would wear, the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. Now that's a near miss. Next up at number 4, Roommate Wanted. We're piling on the creepy with this one, as Reddit user Scars and Stripes tells it. Amanda, their brother's girlfriend, was looking for a new apartment when she was moving into town and wanted to split a house with a like-minded person. She found an ad on Craigslist titled Roommate Wanted, females only, which was common as the area was mainly young professionals. It was a steal of a deal too, $225 a month, and the occupant, who'd listed themselves as a 23-year-old college student that didn't want to share a space with any males. Fair enough, but there was more to it. Much more. When Amanda got there was a sign on the door that said door broken, use back door. So she did, and when she knocked, it was a man who answered, a guy who was clearly in his 40s, unshaven, and looked like he'd been living in a car. Red flag. Definitely a red flag. The man claimed to be the landlord and the occupant was running late from work. He offered to show her around when a few more red flags started to pop up. First, there was no furniture anywhere. The house was blank, boarded up in weird places, and that's when he tried to show her the basement. Fortunately, Amanda, through some quick thinking, managed to flee the house, and when she got home she instantly called the police. Of course, by then the ad had been taken down, but when the police searched the house, they found a strange room that the man had been staying in. There was rotten food and dirty old blankets everywhere, but when they checked the basement, the area that he'd wanted to show her before she escaped, the police found that the man had tied a thin piece of fishing twine at about shin level across the stairs down. The basement was empty save for a broom handle wrapped in old leather belts and a small box filled with rolls of duct tape. It's safe to say Amanda never moved in. Swinging in at number 3, camping horror. Next up is a story from Reddit user NJO Alley, which happened to their parents way back in the late 80s. They were in their mid-20s when they decided to go camping out in the forests of Cool, California. The place, not the state of mind. They arrived kind of late when they started unpacking the truck, when they heard something or someone walking around their campsite. They were already pretty spooked, so they noped out of that particular spot and decided to drive the 3 miles down the road to the next campsite with their headlights off, hoping they wouldn't be followed. Once they got there, they set up camp, had a few beers and listened to a boxing match on the radio. Eventually they got tired and decided to turn in. Their dad nodded off pretty much straight away, but their mum was still half awake when she suddenly heard footsteps from outside the tent. She listened for what seemed like hours when suddenly she heard in the creepiest voice you could ever imagine, "Here I am. I'm going to kill you." Then she heard what she believed to be a knife running along the material of the tent. She was frozen with fear when suddenly she snapped out of it and screamed, "Jim, grab the shotgun, kill that son of a bitch." Damn straight. With that, their dad finally awoke and heard the guy running away. Of course, they didn't have a gun, but it was a bluff that paid off. When they got out of the tent, they found that their tires had been slashed. Thankfully, about an hour or so later, a park ranger pulled up and said that he'd been patrolling the area for any suspicious activity due to a string of recent murders nearby, of which they were probably the next victims. Crazy stuff. Coming in at number 2, Under the Bed. And damn, this one is creepy. As Reddit user Myra tells it, this event occurred sometime around late 2012, after they just moved into their first apartment and in the process of moving in. Myra was on the phone to her boyfriend when she absent-mindedly headed outside to collect her mail. It's important to note this because you'll find out why later. When she came back inside, she sat on her bed opening her mail, still on the phone to her boyfriend, when she accidentally dropped the phone on the floor, landing under the bed. She crouched down to get it when her eyes grew wide in terror. There was someone under her bed. She choked the urge to scream as whoever it was facing the other way and hadn't seen her notice them. Trying to be rational, she quickly picked up the phone, clearly stating her clumsiness out loud, and told her boyfriend she was taking a shower. Of course, she headed in, locked the door, ran the shower, and instantly jumped out of the window. Don't worry, her apartment was on the first floor, the story doesn't end there. She called the police, who instantly told her to get to a safe place and keep an eye on her window and door from across the street. When the cops arrived, they stormed into her apartment and found the man clutching a knife in his hand, standing directly outside the bathroom door, waiting for her to come out. See, he'd snuck in when she was getting a mail and the door closed behind. Close call. Let's not meet that person, ever. And finally, our number 1 spot, he had plans. This story from Reddit user GenLegend3 has a real dark tone to it and probably is the definition of strangers that you wouldn't ever want to meet. Seriously. Ever. When Jen was a kid, she was hanging out in a place she called the Pinecone Forest, a little area that the neighborhood kids called a small patch of trees on the side of the road that they would hang out and play in. She was picking bark off of one of the trees while she waited for her friend Frankie to finish his homework and come out and play. Out of nowhere, a guy came up to her. She could smell him before she saw him, the stench of stale cigarette smoke. He wasn't very old, but he had a very lazy eye, almost cloudy, and his teeth and fingernails were stained yellow. Jen was kind of scared to look at him, but her mum had taught her to be nice to people, so she faked a smile and said hello. He asked her what she was doing and she said she was picking bark off a tree. He replied that she shouldn't do that. Picking bark was like picking off the tree's skin. How would you feel if someone picked off your skin? He said while he pinched her arm with his sharp yellow nails. It's then that Frankie's mum, Sonia, saw what was happening and called out for Jen to come inside. And she did, and she was safe. Little did Jen know, but Sonia had called the police after she saw the man get out of a white van and follow Jen to the Pinecone Forest. When the cops showed up, it turned out that they tailed the guy and followed him just outside of the neighborhood. In the back of his van were binoculars, a Polaroid camera, and pictures of Jen taped all over the walls and the ceiling. Her at school, her at her grandparents' house, her at the bank with her mum, everywhere she went. But that's not all. The man had the key to a storage unit on him too. When the police later checked the location, they found a cabinet full of knives of all kinds, paring knives, a butcher's cleaver, even a melon baller. Alongside that, there were books on anatomy, duct tape, and 10 empty 5-gallon buckets. In the middle of the room, an old bed that was used to restrain mental patients, and the entire unit was covered in plastic wrap. Whatever the stranger intended, he intended to do it to Jen, and thankfully she narrowly avoided that fate. Creepy stuff.